afternoon, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to share screen, if you bear with me, to bring up some charts, and then we will start our conversation. So hopefully you can see the first page of the deck. So as was, said previously, my name is Shawn Rochester, and I wrote a book called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And in that book, I quantify the financial cost of discrimination against Black people in the US. Now, normally when people talk about or think about discrimination, they tend to look at it from the perspective of the injustice or the immorality associated with it. Excuse me, I wanted to look at it from the perspective of what is the cost? And more importantly, what does research from the finest universities in the country say that that cost is? So the book is broken into three parts. In the first part, I look at the financial cost of discrimination in markets that are really critical to wealth accumulation for Black people. So it's housing and automotive, the insurance and financing that underpin those. It's the job search, high-end careers, online commerce, capital raising for business, and so on and so forth. In the second part of the book, I do a look back from the time of slavery and just kind of walk through and describe discriminatory programs and processes that we may be familiar with, but I look at it from the perspective of what was the cost of it up until the present. And then in the third part of the book, I kind of summarize things economically to describe where are we now. And then I propose this economic framework or introduce it. That's called PhD. And PhD stands for Purchase, Hire, and Deposit in ways that create jobs, create and expand business, and provide capital within the Black community. Now, why is this of particular importance? Because pre-COVID, we're missing about 6 million jobs across the broader Black community. We're missing about 1.4 million businesses with employees. Now, you may be aware that there's 2.56 million Black businesses. Again, this is pre-COVID. Those numbers have changed since this pandemic. But only 4% of those businesses actually have any employees. And that 4% generates almost 70% of the revenue from Black enterprise, which is roughly $100 billion, and employs over 1 million people. And we're missing 1.4 million of those. We only have 109,000 Black businesses that have any employees at all. We're missing 1.4. And then those things coupled with this enormous wealth gap that we have are driving about almost all of the socioeconomic problems that we are experiencing. So we're really talking about massive, challenging problems where you need a lot of people at the table to really address these problems, right? Now, so let me, 1 second here to try to advance the charts.
I apologize, but I actually have a question on what you define as the cost of discrimination or racism within America, or systemic racism, as excluding elements of morality and unethical treatment of racism. When you say cost, do you mean as in the cost, the general cost or financial cost of the overall mistreatment from federal government, or do you mean from general individual businesses, or can you possibly elaborate on the idea?
So let's hold the questions for the Q&A section. I'm going to go into great detail on that. I very much appreciate it. I think I got the charts working now, so we can advance it, right? So I'm going to get right into that question. We're not going to dodge that at all. As I was saying before, the technical challenge on my end was that efficient problem solving, right, requires that we all get together at the table to try to solve these challenges. But here's the problem. It's really difficult to solve problems if A, people don't see the problem, or B, if they think you're the problem, right? If you would just fix you, we would all be great. And I'm going to share a couple of platitudes with you guys that you may have heard of. For example, Black folks are simply not trying hard enough. That has more to blame with not getting ahead than any form of racial discrimination. Over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. You may have heard Black people have the same or better chance, right, at getting ahead in America than even white folks do. So you got over 6 in 10 Americans believe that. Or you may have heard that racism, quite frankly, is just an excuse for failure, right? The failure is mine, and instead of me owning it, I spent all my time pointing my finger at other people. right? As opposed to addressing the issue myself. You know, you got 7 to 10 Americans that believe that. Here's kind of the challenge is that really effective problem solving needs to be based on a foundation of empathy and understanding, with empathy being how do you put yourself in a position of, from another person's perspective, really to understand what they're going through and also to understand the pathology behind it. Like, how did they get there in the first place? And understanding is just how do we use knowledge and data and information to make the world a better place for ourselves and for our fellow man. Now, if these things that I just expressed here are the background thinking, then they tend to show up in the policies and programs and solutions that are actually designed to develop to address these issues. So what I want to do with you is share a quote with you from Albert Einstein. He gave this in 1946 to his address to the National Urban League. And he said, "We must make every effort to ensure that the past injustice, violence, and economic discrimination, which by definition is the black tax, will be made known to the people. The taboo, let's not talk about it, must be broken." So taking advice and guidance from Mr. Einstein, let's talk about it. So in a short time that we have this afternoon, what I'm going to do is talk about how is it that after 400 years, over 40 million African Americans own just about 2% of US wealth. Either we are consistent with philosophy, inept, or there's something else going on in the environment that we need to take a closer look at and really understand. That's what I want to do. Let's take a closer look, right, at kind of what's going on in the environment. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to the time of slavery, right? Now, I'm not going to discuss the horrors of that institution. There have been tombs written on that, but I do want to look at things from an economic perspective, right? And one of the first things that we need to understand is that slavery, by definition, is a 100% tax on your labor. Quite simply, that means that nothing that you produce is yours, not even you or yours. And if you go back to that time, there's many things you could never put a price on. You could never value. Right? But if you get stuck, you could never value. You could never value, what it is to be, a woman and never have control over your body for the entirety of your life. You could never value what it is to be a man and to be unable to protect your loved ones at any kind of point in time. And there are many other things you couldn't value, but there are things that you can value, which is the labor extracted from millions of people over almost a 250-year period, right? And economists have taken a look at that. And what their estimates say is, that number could be as high as 24 trillion. Others say it could be as high as 97 trillion. We assume that the truth is somewhere in the middle of those estimates. Then perhaps it's as high as $50 trillion in terms of the labor extracted from millions of people over almost a quarter of a millennia, right? Now, that's not the only thing that you can value from that period of time. If you go back to 1860, right, shortly before emancipation, you've got 4 million people, held in bondage. And those people are the most liquid asset in the country. They represent 50% of the full economic value of the South, and they're traded on open markets, right? So there's a price if you're old or young, able-bodied or lame, male or female, so on and so forth. So it turns out that the value of those folks is so large that you have to measure it in terms of national wealth or national income or GDP. So the estimates place the value of those people at between 16 and 20% of US wealth, or about 1 to 2 years of GDP or national income. So if you look at it from a wealth perspective, we're talking about 15.5 trillion. Now my numbers are from 2016, national wealth has gone up. But in 2016, US wealth was $85 trillion. 16 to 20% of that is 14 to 17 trillion. Taking about average of those two, you're at 15.5. If you look at it from an income perspective, it's 28.5 trillion. And how do we come up with that? Well, the estimate is that their value is between 1 and 2 years of GDP or national income, and national income pre-COVID was $19 trillion, right? So that's a range of 19 to 38 trillion. Take an average of those, you're at 28.5. So those are two different independent modes to come up with the value of those people. From an economic perspective, if you take an average of those two modes, that's 22 trillion. Now you can go back to 1839 and you can look at the estimates from Henry Clay, who's estimating the value of people held in bondage at that time on the floor of the US Senate. He places the value of roughly $1.2 billion, right? If you look at the work from Thomas Piketty, he very clearly lays out that the economic return on an annual basis for slave-related investments was 6 to 8%. If you use something that was very conservative, that's outside of that range, which is about 5.5%, you're at $24 trillion, right, or better in today's dollars. And if you go back to the 1810s and you look at the estimates from Thomas Jefferson himself and James Madison, they placed the value of people held in bondage at that time at roughly 1 year of GDP or national income, which would be about $19 trillion in today's equivalent, or it would require the sale of 1/3 of all public lands, right? So the idea here is that no matter how you look at this, you're talking about really massive, hard to conceive numbers in terms of, labor extracted and the economic value of, right, people held in bondage in the U.S. Now, if we talk, so from a slavery perspective, it can easily be, $50 trillion. If we talk about the economic impact, right, let's think about what is the net worth of 45 million African Americans today, or Black people in America. It's roughly $1.5 trillion. The implication of that is we just established that the value of those people held in bondage, right, in 1860 was 22 trillion, which means that 4 million, people held in bondage in 1860 had an economic value that was 15 times more than the net worth of 45 million Black people held today. I mean, that's just the math, associated with that. Now, you can say, listen, I get it. Those are some really large numbers that I wasn't familiar with. But let's not forget that this was over 150 years ago. And a lot of time has passed between then and now. And, other people have come here, they've struggled, they've been discriminated against, but yet they've gone on to do really well. Why is it that, Black people are still in this situation, right? And one of the things that we have to remember, even with, for important questions like that, is those people left bondage with no economic resources, right? If you go to 1860, 1870, Black people own about 0.17% of US wealth, not zero, but effectively zero. And they left bondage with no economic resources. We're all familiar with the conversation around 40 acres and a mule. We all know that that never happened. There was a distribution of land which did occur, which is called the Homestead Act, which you guys, I'm pretty sure, remember from history or social studies in middle school. And what I've thought is, what would those things be worth in today's equivalent, right? Just so we can get a sense of the economic impact of land distributed and resources not distributed. So if you look at 40 acres and a mule, and we put the mule aside for the moment, we can value the impact of that, but we put that aside for the moment. We just look at the land. You talk about 4 million people held in bondage and 40 acres and a mule. That can put you, at 140 million acres. If you look at the price of an acre on average, it's between $3,020 and $6,350. Again, these kind of farm acres, these are not, Manhattan acres or DC acres or, New York City or Bay Area acres. It's just kind of farmland. Quick math on that puts the value of that at about $1 trillion in today's dollars. It would be generating about $90 billion a year. $1 trillion sounds like a lot. It's a relatively large number, but it's only about 2% of the 50 trillion, right? That was estimated to be extracted from those people and those who came, before them. That never transpired. But something that did happen is the Homestead Act. And that happened in 1862, right? Congress passed this act called the Homestead Act, in which they would proceed to distribute 246 million acres to about 1.5 million white families over the course of the next 60 years, right? So if you use the same estimates that to price the 40 acres and a mule, quick math puts the value of that distribution at about $1.6 trillion, or a little more than $1 million a family, right? Now, I'm all for hard work and bootstrapping and the like, but, $1 million a family is a hell of a bootstrap. So how did it work? You had the opportunity to claim about 160 acres of land on average. And if you were so fortunate to be able to make that claim, if you just stayed on that land for a 5-year period, you'd be able to take possession of that land for little or no consideration at all. Here's the other thing that is important to understand is that if you were from Europe and you came to the US with really nothing but the shirt on your back, which is what transpired in a lot of cases, and you were so fortunate to be able to claim one of these parcels, not only at the end of 5 years could you take possession of that land, but you could also naturalize or become a citizen, because that's about how long it took to become a citizen during those years. Now, researchers say that the direct beneficiaries associated with this are up to 93 million Americans. Again, this is direct, not secondary, tertiary related kind of sort of, for this kind of massive government distribution and giveaway of land and resources. If you fast forward, you get into the point where, you know, the Civil War has occurred, and you know, people held in bondage has been emancipated, right? We're looking at a situation where the Southern economy is clearly devastated, right, from the war. The global cotton market is devastated, right? The land confiscated in the South as a result of the Civil War, and it was confiscated, was returned, right, to the planter class. And there is a need for cheap, massive, abundant, and available labor, right? Now, I just kind of fast forwarded through a lot of things. So let me just kind of double back here and speak on a few things real quick. The global cotton market was kind of like oil. It was the first truly global market. It was the foundation of the industrialization that happened, you know, across the Western world, you know, because of that. 20 million people were employed in this market around the world. 1 million of those people lost their jobs as a result of the Civil War and emancipation. The U.S. dominates 80% of that entire market. You cannot beat, you know, free labor. Raw cotton from the South is 61% of U.S. Exports. It affects the entire world, right? It affects India, it affects Egypt, it affects Europe, of course, it affects, you know, Japan. It leaves the world in a global cotton famine, right? And the world's crying out, what is America going to do to put a newly freed people back to work, right? And the answer to that is this construct that's called Jim Crow, which is an amazingly non-descriptive name, right? Like, you know, what is that and what does it mean? It turns out that Jim Crow is a system of laws and customs that are reinforced with an extraordinary level of violence, right? That's designed to reimpose 100% tax on a sharecropper's labor. Now, this might sound like hyperbolic, right? Like you like the numbers and the data, but clearly these people were poor. We know that for sure, but they must have had something, right? It seems like saying 100% tax is being a little hyperbolic. So what I'll do is I'll let you decide whether or not it was 100% tax. So let's kind of talk about it a little bit. What was sharecropping and how did it work, right? So it's you know, it's fundamentally a contract, right? And the large mega plantations, right, are kind of broken into smaller lots. Newly freed people, you know, settle on those smaller lots and agree to plant cash crops. And in reward for that, when they take those crops to market, they share in a portion of the crop, literally where the name comes from, right? Sharecropping. Here's the challenge associated with this contract. Number one, all the terms and conditions are set by the small white farmer. Some of those terms and conditions say that if you fall ill, they have the right to outsource your labor to someone else and charge you back for it. The challenge, right, associated with this is that you know, the harvest does not come tomorrow, right? It comes at the end of the season or at the end of the year. And these people came out of bondage with no economic resources. So between now, when they start, and when they harvest, that farmer has to provide them, or landowner has to provide them with food and clothes and shelter, as well as the tools and the seed and the fertilizer and everything that they need to bring that crop, right, to cultivate it and bring it to market. So, and they're doing it at rates as high as 70% per year. So in effect, they're setting your cost structure, right? Now, at the end of the season, when you take the crops to market, right, what you have to understand is that small white farmer or landowner is the market. They tell you what the crops are worth, right? Now think about that, which means that they control your revenue or income by definition. And if someone controls your revenue and they control your cost structure, by definition, they control your profit. And that's where you see this 100% tax, right, coming into play. Now, if you're fortunate, your profit will net to zero. If you're unfortunate and you work for someone who is concerned that you might go to work for someone who is more generous, they may have your profit be negative, where your expenses are greater than your revenue, and they'll roll that over into the next year. And now you're in a mode of perpetual debt servitude, right? Now, I know what you're thinking in terms of that construct, which is, that's a horrible deal, right? And it is. And I would never take that deal. And I agree with you. I would never want to take, a deal like that. But if you don't take it, they got the law for that. And those laws are called vagrancy laws. And those laws state that if you can't prove that you're a landowner or that you're gainfully employed, they could charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail, right? Now, that might take you aback and be like, I didn't see that one coming. So in that case, I might sign the contract. But, upon second thought, it's just a horrible deal. I'm just, even though I signed the contract, I'm not going to do it. If you took that position, they have a law for that. And those are called contract enforcement laws. And those laws state that you broke that employment contract. And if you break that contract, they could charge you with a criminal offense and put you in a state or county jail, right? And then you could be like, okay, fine, then put me in jail and I'll sit there and you'll feed me 3 square meals a day until you get tired. Then you can let me out. And if you take that position, they have something for that. It's called contract enforcement laws. Oh, and it's called, bear with me here. Here we go. It's called convict leasing. And which means that they'll lease you back out to the same, landowner or private corporation that you didn't want to work to in the first place. And what we all have to understand about this construct, this notion of convict leasing, is there's one aspect of it that you could say is even worse than slavery, in this kind of one respect, which is that while a slave owner will kill you and beat you within an inch of your life, slaves are expensive. And they would much rather have you around for another 5 or 10 or 15 years to maximize the return on their investment. They have what's known as an interest in your residual value, right? But under convict leasing, they have no such interest. They only care about you during a period of time for which you were contracted with them. 6 months, 8 months, 18 months, that's it. They don't care about your life beyond that, right? And under those contracts, you're looking at mortality rates that are approaching 50%, which is a 1 in 2 chance of death. Now, while that is draconian, it's extremely lucrative. So much so that if you go back to 1914, and you look at the state of Alabama's revenues, about 20% of those revenues are coming from convict leasing alone. And there are estimates that place that number substantially higher than that, right? Now, again, while this is a, extraordinarily, dark period, we normally go through dark times, right? And it lasts for a period and you come out the other side and you start to move on. But we have to understand this wasn't a bad 3 or 4 year period, right? Or even 5-year period or 10-year period. This thing lasted roughly for about 75 years, from about 1870 to 1945. And during that period of time, as we know, about 4,000 Black people that we can document were lynched. Clearly the number is higher than that, but that's a public execution by your fellow citizen, right? During that period of time. It's the equivalent of executing 1 Black person per week for 75 years. Nobody's been prosecuted for that, right? Under those conditions, you will get the hint. Your family will get the hint. Your church will get the hint. Your community will get the hint, right? So I think you start to see what I mean by 100% tax on your labor. And if you do have 100% tax on your labor, that is slavery by definition, which is why this period is often called slavery by another name, right? So if we, there's a quote from a farmer in the Mississippi Delta, and he says, I've been working these deltas for 30 years, right? And every year I know I've been robbed. But what can you do? If I speak up, I get cussed. If I raise up, I get shot, right? So if during a period of, legal constitutional slavery, 50 trillion were extracted from millions of people during that period of time, and this is slavery by definition, which lasted for another 75 years, roughly a third longer. You can argue that over that 15-year period, an additional 15 trillion was extracted from these newly freed people and their descendants, right? Because of this, construct. So when you think about that, upon slavery, the abolishment of slavery or emancipation and the conclusion of the Civil War, this planter class lost about $22 trillion worth of economic value, and they would go on and proceed to claw back about 15 of that over the next, 75 or so years from those newly freed people and their descendants, right? So if we look at that period of Jim Crow, we're talking about, 15 trillion. Now you could say, listen, I get it, and that's a more draconian than I was aware, but not everybody was under Jim Crow, right? Some people did get an education, and education is a great, equalizer, right? And education is the great equalizer. And, people like W.E.B. Du Bois did get an education. He went to Harvard during that period of time. But what we have to understand is that the white planter class, their desire was for cheap, readily abundant labor. It was not an expanded public education. Small white farmers absolutely were interested in the expansion of public education for their children, as they should be. Clearly, newly freed Black people were interested in that for themselves and for their children. What happened is that the white planter class needed the alliance of the smaller white farmers, right? So they supported the expansion of public education with the intention of directing resources from Black children to white children. So if you look at work done by Du Bois, he says in the 40 years since emancipation, Negro taxes and Negro share of income from indirect taxes and endowments is fully repaid, right? Investments made by whites into newly freed people's education. He's just remarking on the investment made in the education of newly freed Black people so little that their own investment, right, was superior to those of the broader American electorate. If you look at the words of Thomas Logan, who was a former Confederate general and industrialist, he says, listen, the freedman, when the freedman regards himself qualified to earn a support by mental work, he is unwilling to accept manual labor, which is what they wanted and needed. If you look at the words of William H. Baldwin, who's the president of the General Education Board, think of this as like the Department of Education before the Department of Education. He said that the Negroes in the South needed to be educated so they could be the best possible laborers, but with the right kind of education, Negroes will willingly work manual jobs, and that will open up opportunities for Southern whites to do the more expert labor. Now you have to juxtapose that with the fact that during the period of slavery, the vast majority of the artisans and craftspeople were Black, right? People who were held in bondage. And now they're being shifted away from that work into just kind of menial labor that's not utilizing their economic, their brain power. So if you go to 1917, in terms of the limited investment in the education of Black people, you see there's 64 high schools that are designated for Black students. Again, that's not in a district or county or state. That's across the entirety of the South. Most of those are built, right, and the vast majority of those are built and owned by Black people. Typically appendages to churches, right, and the like, as you would imagine. If you go to New York City in the 1920s, they're spending 15 times more or 50 times more on per student on education than South Carolina is spending on Black students, right, held in the segregated, South. So at that time, New York City is about 97.1% white. So if you're an immigrant coming from Europe with nothing literally but the shirt on your back, and if you settled in that New York City area, 50 times more is being invested in your human capital development than a Black child in the South whose family and descendants and predecessors have been here for hundreds of years, right? Very difficult to develop under those circumstances. If you look in the South, for every dollar invested to educate a Black student, $5 to $8 are invested to educate a white child. There's no rocket science there. If you do that with your children, one's going to go to Harvard, one's going to be impoverished. Black teachers are earning roughly 25 to 34 cents on a dollar for their white peers, teaching the same exact subject. Very difficult to accumulate wealth. Obviously, white students are receiving 50% more years of education by the time they're age 25 than their Black peers. If you look at Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, and he wrote this in the 50s, so he's talking about the first half of the 20th century. He says in the last 40 to 50 years, Negroes have advanced little relative in the occupational hierarchy. So you open up a new plant, there's a new janitor, right? There's not a new Black manager or engineer or salesperson or so on and so forth. And he said the same is actually true in the North. So researchers actually say that the level of maldistribution of resources was so significant that if you just kept the other forms of discrimination the same, but you invested equally in the children, that alone could have cut the wage gap by up to 50%. right? Which is an extraordinary thing for millions and millions of children, right? So if you look at that over a generation of millions of children, you're talking about over $600 billion of lost economic impact associated with the malinvestment, right, in human capital development for Black children. If you look at that over a 90-year period, right, from 1865 to 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, you're talking about over $3 trillion, right, of impact in terms of maldistribution, um, investment in education. Now, so that is massive, and it has a huge impact. Now you could say, okay, I get it. I hear what you're saying. These are large numbers, right? But truth be told, back in the day, you didn't need a super duper education, right? We all have a story of a grandfather, right, or great grandfather had a third grade education, maybe a fifth grade education, but a terrific work ethic, and built a home and accumulated property, did some wonderful things, right, for the family and their community, right? So it's much more about, real estate, right, home ownership. And I agree, housing is the great, wealth builder, for sure. Housing is part of the American dream. The country believes deeply in it. The government invests heavily in ensuring that dream is a reality for millions of people. So much so that during those times, the federal government invested over $120 billion, right, into subsidizing home ownership for American citizens. It's the equivalent of about $1 trillion today. Here's the challenge: less than 2% of that went to Black Americans, while over 20 million Europeans who came here during that period of time, after they naturalized, had access to all those economic resources versus Black people who did not. So I won't kind of go into redlining, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, but it's the federal government created the mortgage as we know it, right? They guaranteed payments for U.S. citizens that lowered the risk for the banks, that allowed you to have lower down payments, allowed you to have more reasonable interest rates, and a 30-year repayment period. They did not guarantee those loans for Black citizens, and certainly for Black citizens who were interested in moving into white communities. The financial institutions follow suit, with that. So if you wanted to go directly to the developers follow suit with that. If you wanted to, figure it out with the real estate agents, they would recuse themselves from those types of transactions. And even your fellow citizens would sign covenants amongst themselves saying, if you sell, your property in this community, you'll sell it to a person of Caucasian or European descent. So there was a total wall, right, that was preventing Black people from participating in this space. All of this sounds like a very qualitative conversation right now, but what we can say in a concrete, definitive way is that between 1930 and 1960, less than 1% of all mortgages in the United States went to African Americans. Less than 1%. So that's an extraordinary inability to participate in the greatest wealth building vehicle that's ever existed, which is real estate, right, in America. So just because you can't participate, right, in this government sponsored home ownership doesn't mean that you don't want the American dream. You clearly want a home. So what a lot of people had to do was they turned to private markets under a construct called contract sales. And in the private markets, there's no appraisal required. So people are selling homes that are 2x the actual market price. You have very high interest rates associated with it. And you don't earn any equity in the house. And this is actually the worst part of it. And what I mean by that is if we agree that after 100 installment payments, that I would take possession of your house, right? And I made 99 of those payments on time, but I missed the 100th. You have the ability to keep my 99 payments, keep my down payment, to evict me from the house, and to resell it. It's an extraordinarily draconian practice that was unfortunately practiced extremely widely, right? So much so that it's estimated, that in the 1950s, if you look at the greater Chicagoland area, which was a huge area for Black people migrating out of the South, about 85% of all real estate transactions that took place with respect to Black people happened under this predatory construct. Very, very difficult to accumulate wealth under those circumstances. Now, if you say, listen, just kind of hunker down where you are, and this will pass, right? And you'll be able to take advantage of things after it passes. Very difficult to do. It turns out that in these kind of poor Black urban communities, rents are 50%, more than 50% higher than outside of these communities. Now, this doesn't make any intuitive sense at first, right? But here's the challenge. You've got millions of people, right? Close to 6 million people fleeing the tyranny of the South, unable to move wherever they want and being corralled into these, urban inner city areas, right? So what happens when the demand for housing rises faster than the actual availability of the housing? The price goes up. So the rents, right? The cost of housing inside these communities is actually higher than outside of the communities. Again, how do you accumulate wealth, under those circumstances? And in 1968, the Federal Trade Commission did a study, and they found that goods and services inside of these Black inner city communities, these urban ghettos, as they call them, are 3 times more expensive than outside of it. Extremely expensive, right? And very difficult to accumulate wealth. If you just hunker down and work hard, which there's no lack of that, the challenge is that, researchers who look at labor market discrimination, right, from the 1930s up until the 70s, say that the impact of the economic cost of discrimination against Black people within the labor market was roughly 1.6 trillion. That's in 1983 dollars. It's over 4 trillion in today's, economic equivalent. So this, I think, feeds into why, if you look at white Americans born between 1946 and 1951, they would go on to accumulate 11 times more wealth and their Black peers born at the same time. We've been told that that's about hard work and stick-to-itiveness and decisions that you make and not make. But, what the data is showing quite clearly and empirically is that environment has so much more, right, to do with that, particularly relative to what we've been told. Now, so the impact of housing and of course of labor market discrimination is enormous. I won't have time to go into the details on the New Deal and the GI Bill, interstate highway construction, but we see that these are massive, multi-trillion, or to look at what was the cost of discrimination post the civil rights era, right, from then up until now. But I do cover those things in the book. Which I encourage you guys to take a look at. So let's take a look at kind of where are we now, if we just look at things from an economic kind of perspective, right? So the Black community is missing about $1.5 trillion of revenue on an annual basis. $1 trillion of that associated with business income from businesses that are not in place, and about $0.5 trillion is associated with consumer income, which is group spending, right? We of course talked about there's a significant wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. It's actually much larger than 8 trillion. And then we mentioned already the 6 million jobs and 4.4 million businesses that were missing pre-COVID. These numbers have been exacerbated since then. But one of the things that I saw when I was doing the research for this was this number that kept coming up again and again and again. It was just 2%. And what I found was it seemed like in areas and markets that are really critical for wealth accumulation, that we tend to hover at around about 2% or so participation rate. So if you look at corporate supply chain spend, right, it's less than 2%. Again, this is not a diversity, minority, inclusion type number. I'm talking with Black enterprise specifically. If you look at government supply chain spend at all levels, federal, state, local, so on and so forth, it's like 2%. Right, on average, across those. If you look at even how much, Black people in the United States spend on their own businesses and enterprise and services, it's around 2%, right? So, and if you look at areas and occupations that are high growth, high compensation areas, the participation rate tends to be around 2%. From a banking perspective, about $4 out of every $10,000 in U.S. banking system is in a Black bank. So there's certainly not enough capital for these banks to lend in a non-discriminatory way to businesses and to citizens, alike. And then, of course, if you look at SBA lending, less than 2% of that goes to Black enterprise. The number is actually 1.6%, on average. So all of this really creates a very large negative, depressive impact on job creation and business development, right, within the Black community. So one of the things I want to talk about is this great question that I got the first time I spoke at Google. And it was, we understand better the economic cost of Black people, right? Of discrimination on Black people, for sure. But could you help us understand what the cost has been for the country? Which I thought was an excellent and profound question. And I did not have the answer right at the time. And I said that I would take a look at it, right? And I was fortunate enough to be invited back to speak, at Google again. And I said, I'm going to answer the question, and I'm going to do it under this kind of construct, which is, what if Black Americans had been allowed to fully participate in the innovation system that drove the economy? What would have been the impact? And this is really important because, I spent some time talking about this Jim Crow period, which is roughly 1870 to about 1945. But we also have to remember that this period is also one of the most important, if not the most important part of the Industrial Revolution. During this period, 2.5 million patents are created. We're talking about patents for technologies that drive the economy that we know today. The telephone, the light bulb, motion pictures, photocopiers, radios, transistors, airplanes, automobiles, a host of things that are so critical to the foundation of our economy was all developed at the time. How many of those patents are attributed to Black people? The answer is 726. Almost a complete and utter shutout from the innovation process, right? Now, why is this of particular importance? If you look at Professor Kortun from Yale University, he says patents can be thought of as proportional improvements in productivity, right? That a constant rate of new patents can generate a constant rate of economic growth. This is empirical. You can look at this as a data over the last 100+ years, right? The Brookings Institute says that the nation's unequal access to high quality schooling deprives the nation's the innovation system of people who might otherwise make or commercialize important discoveries. Something that's really, really important for us all to understand is that talent, skill, capability, all that stuff follows a normal distribution, right? Which is just, and it's across ethnicities, regions, it's across everything, right? It's just from a human perspective. And it's just a fancy way of saying 70% of the people are in the middle, 15% are significantly above average, 15% are significantly, below average, right? So a question that I thought was important to explore is, what was the size of this 15% that's above average, right? I call it the ultra brilliant. We all like to think we're part of that group, right? What was the size of that population, and what was that population doing across this period of time that we discussed? So, so if you go back to 1870, 730,000 of these people. Again, this is not the Black population. This is that 15%, right? That tend to be substantially above, everyone else. What are those folks doing, right? If you go to 1900, you got 1.3 million of those people. If you go to 1930s, almost 1.8 million. If you go to 1950, you got 2.3 million of these folks. What are they doing during this period of time, right? 1870, 1900, 1930, they're engaged in various forms of sharecropping and tenant farming and the like, right? A massive, complete underutilization of these people's brilliance and their ability to contribute to the economy in a powerful and profound way. And in 1950, you got 2.3 million of these folks. What are they doing? Black people at that time, only 1.6% of them even have college degrees. 1936, you still have almost 4 million Black people work in the fields as you did in 1860. So what would have been the impact on US wealth? So if these people and their brilliance had been fully incorporated into the innovation system, we'd be looking at 280,000 incremental patents, right? Which would have translated to $2 trillion more on an annual basis of economic output, right, to the country. Now, work from, McKinsey and Company has already established, right, that in their view, if you close the wealth gap, they would generate another $1.5 trillion, right, which again is very consistent with the numbers that I showed in terms of what's missing from Black income. And the incremental wealth associated with this would be over $9 trillion of wealth to the whole country. Right. So, what I want us to know is that, Gary Becker, who wrote The Economics of Discrimination, who won a Nobel Prize, says both parties are affected, both the discriminator and a person who is discriminated against pay an economic price for that discrimination. Right. And we've seen what that price is for Black people. It's massive and draconian without question, right? But you also see that that cost has also been enormous for the country. At the end of the day, discrimination is bad for the system. It's bad for capitalism, right? It's bad for the shareholder. It makes the pie smaller, not larger, right? The ability to develop people and help deploy their skills maximizes things for everyone. So there's a researcher from Michigan State University. She did some really interesting work, and she looked at this question, which is, what if white Americans had experienced the level of trauma that Black Americans experienced during the Jim Crow system, period? What would have happened specifically to innovation if they had to deal with that? And her research says that 40% of the patents would have never been created. That's 1 million patents, right? Which of these things can we afford not to have? Motion pictures, semiconductors, upon which all of technology is built on, so on and so forth. What would have been the economic impact? And that impact would have been, we'd have over almost 8 trillion less in national income, and over 30 trillion less in national wealth, right? So these are really, really important and profound things to look at. So I'm going to share 2 quotes with you as I kind of wrap things up here. One again is from Albert Einstein, and he said, "The worst disease under which the nation of our society suffers, in my opinion, is the treatment of the Negro." Now, we've talked about what some of that looks like from an economic perspective in this talk this morning. He said this in 1946, again, in his address to the National Urban League. Emperor Selassie of Ethiopia said in his address to the United Nations General Assembly in 1963 that the basis of racial discrimination has been economic. And it is with the economics that these evils can be overcome. With that said, I'm going to pause here. We can kind of switch to Q&A. We can talk about solutions, the PhD economic framework, the need for specificity, and that minority does not mean Black, and any other questions that you guys may have.
Shawn, thank you. Everyone, for our Q&A, what we'd like to do, just so we can get as many questions in as possible, as I mentioned at the beginning, please just send your questions in a private chat to Tamara Ferguson, and she will read the questions to Shawn, and Shawn will answer. We just think that may be the best way to move through the process. So with that, Tamara, I'll hand it over to you.
Right. So first question we have, what would you say has been the most positively impactful reaction you've seen after sharing this information?
Wow. The good thing is that there's a lot to choose from. I have seen people re-architect how their kind of churches spend money in terms of this PhD economic framework. They looked and they saw that they weren't spending a lot of, even though they were a Black church, they weren't spending a lot of money with Black businesses in terms of their advisors and the like, that they didn't have their money in Black financial institutions when it was possible, right? That they wanted to do more to create economic opportunities for kind of Black enterprises. That was huge. You know, I've seen, and by the way, these are people who I don't know that reach out to me and kind of tell me based on their interface with the books or talks or whatever, the actions that they're taking. What I've seen is, you know, people from multi-billion-dollar organizations putting plans in place to be able to increase the presence of Black people on their payroll and the supply chain, and to use their liquidity, right, their balance sheets, to be able to do more business with Black enterprise. They're literally architecting and trying to figure out, how do we go about doing this? And then there's also, you know, many individuals, right, who are like, you know, it's highly comprehended. They're like, you changed my life and the life of our family. Like, we think differently, we operate differently. You know what I mean? Like, when possible and where possible, we're going to seek to include and do business with Black enterprise. You know, we're fortunate, we buy, you know, fancy homes and stuff like that. You have significant transaction fees. We really use, you know, our realtors in that affects families and communities, and it ripples through time. And they've really kind of changed around who they're doing business with and doing it in a more conscious way to help create more jobs and more business and provide more capital in the Black community. So there's a lot of positive reaction That makes me feel good. We certainly need more though.
Great. I'm thinking just to segue off of that, is it possible for you to maybe go through the concept of PhD since it relates very much to that answer?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So PhD again stands for purchase, hire, and deposit in ways that create jobs, create business, and provide capital within the Black community, right? So we talked about why this is important. So we got a massive jobs gap that's been consistent for 150 years post-emancipation. We got a massive business infrastructure gap that's been consistent for 150 years post-emancipation, right? We got a massive wealth gap, again, that's consistent for the entirety of that time. So we have to do things that are stimulative to creating jobs, business, and providing capital. It's a very kind of powerful, economic framework. So if you look at the P aspect of it, the purchase, as an individual, that's just how we spend our money. And we have total control over that. You don't need to act at Congress, you don't need anybody's permission. You can choose to spend your money with who you want, and you could do it in ways that are very, very stimulative. So when you think about, if I'm so fortunate to buy a home, who's your realtor? Who's the insurance broker? Who's the mortgage broker, right? If you gotta, make it, from a transaction into a home, so you want to make some adjustments to the kitchen or the bath or the basement or the roof or fix things up, what contractors do you use? We have tremendous and amazing talent, right? That are roofers and carpenters and electricians and people who do plumbing and HVAC and all that kind of stuff. Are we using us? Because these are large spend items that are economically transformative. When we think about businesses and institutions and corporations, that's supply chain spend. And Black levels of engagement in those are horrifically low. You can create 10, 15, 20,000 jobs by who you incorporate into your supply chain. You know what I mean? So if we want to have economic impact, do more business with Black enterprise. It's massively, enormously stimulative for job creation, right? And then when we talk about the D aspect of it, that's about deposits, right? That really stands for how are we making capital available? Because capital is necessary. Business acquisition requires capital, right? Business formation requires capital, right? Business growth requires capital. So we got to make sure that institutions are well capitalized. And you can start with, Black financial institutions. I talked about banks, but you also have credit unions, you have CDFIs, you have other institutions that are really focused on providing the availability of capital in the form of, loans and other types of financing at ways that are affordable for the Black communities. It's very critical. Home ownership, right, requires access to capital to purchase the home, so on and so forth. So individuals can do that by who they choose to bank with. Corporations and institutions, right, and governments can do that by how they choose to utilize their balance sheet, their available cash on their balance sheets, right, to put that into institutions that are now providing liquidity or lending, right? For example, you guys probably saw the announcement from Netflix, right? They said, we're going to take 2% of our available cash, roughly $100 million, and we're going to put that into Black, financial institutions, right, to be able to provide lending and liquidity. Every dollar that you put into, a bank can have a 10x multiplier effect, right, across the broader community. So that's a huge impact. It's very necessary. You can make those decisions. Corporations can make those decisions. Universities can make those decisions. Philanthropies can make those decisions. It's huge. Like, let me give you a concrete example. I think it was in 2015 or 2016. If you look at home ownership, Black people bought 177,000 homes, right? Which is significantly under what we should be acquiring, right, and the level of homes that we should have. But if you utilize Black realtors, you'd need 14,000 more Black realtors working 8 hours a day to close all those transactions, right? Think about the impact of resources, right, that now flows through their communities. If you think about where we buy our cars, we buy 5 million cars a year, almost over $90 billion, right, a year on cars. Are we buying it from Black auto dealers? The 16,000 auto dealers pre-COVID, right? Only 264 were Black. Out of all that, we're missing almost 2,000 of them. That would create hundreds of thousands of really great jobs, right? If you ever taken your car in to get it fixed, these are really great jobs, right? It's 66 jobs per dealer on average, right? So these are things that you can do now, right? Without without people's permission. And it's things that corporations can do to get away from just being symbolic. Whatever you do, it has to be economic, it has to be scalable, and then it has to lead to structural change, right? So this PhD framework is exactly that. It's a framework by which you judge the impact and efficacy of whatever your plan or program is, right? When Europeans who came to the United States, not the United States, but to the New World and set up their colonies and decided that they want to create their own country, they created a framework. That framework was called the US Constitution. And it is you judge everything consistent with, is it in keeping with this framework, right? So PhD is a framework that says, is it stimulative for job creation, business development, or capital availability and affordability, in the Black community specifically, right? So short answer through a longer answer.
Perfect, thank you. Next one is, are there still any elements of convict leasing today?
Yeah, I mean, prisoners are being outsourced to work for people at $1, $1.50, XYZ per. I mean, yes, the short version is yes, and it's being done because it's profitable and it's legal.
All right. So how do we get deniers of systemic racism to open their minds and hearts to the data that supports it?
So I think the question is, if I could reframe it, is how do we get more information to people in general, right? Because what you have to do, I think, is you have to you have only limited time, energy, and effort. And I don't think that you should spend time with the intransigent. If you're committed to being impervious to new information, to even examining it critically and deciding whether or not it matters to you, I don't think you should spend time with those people. There's a ton of folks who don't know, right? They have no idea about this. What they know is what they have been told and what they have seen and experienced. This is not available in K through 12. We have 50 million kids in a K through 12 program across the US, right? This is not available in post-secondary when you go to university. Maybe you walk into an African-American studies class that touches a slice of what kind of I'm talking about. And it's certainly not available in our other institutions like our places of worship. So how are people going to get any of this kind of information in the first place? So there's a ton of folks who are just like, my God, I just never knew. Like, and how could they know? So you have to get the information in front of as many people as possible so those who are willing to examine it critically can. And then what you generally start to see is people who start to say, well, what can we do? And that's the point. We need to get away from the why the conversation is necessary, because that slows everything else down to, I get it, I see it, it's massive and it's daunting. What do we do? And how do we do it? How can we do it in the most effective way, right? So that's what I would say. You don't need everyone. It can feel enormous and daunting. We're not here to boil the ocean, right? The ability to allocate capital, the ability to formulate and execute policy and to execute on all these things is not egalitarian. It's in the hands of a fairly small group of people. And all you need is a critical mass of individuals that kind of see it and they understand that the pie actually expands. And the vast majority of people follow what's in front of them. They're actually not architects of what's in front of them. So it's how to get the message in front of the most folks, and the most folks who are just willing to consider it and be exposed to it.
Okay, I feel like you've somewhat answered this question with that last answer, but I just want to bring it up again just in case if there's any additional items you want to discuss. But what have been some other challenges maybe you've seen people run into when they're working through addressing these issues, and what are some successful strategies they've had to overcome them?
I mean, there's a myriad of challenges, right? I mean, you have to deal with the fact that people have extremely strong positions, right, that are based on little facts, even less context, and then there's an asymmetric distribution of power. They control the conversation and they control the economics, right? That makes any conversation, very, very difficult. So you have to have a whole strategy around how you even engage with folks, right? My strategy is to disarm. most people don't know enough to really engage, right, in this conversation. And so first you have to give them access to the information. So if you think slavery wasn't a big deal, all right, I get it. The implication of what you said is you think it's a small economic price. That's it. If you lose 5 cents, you don't really care. You lose $50 million. It's a big deal. At the end of the day, it's what's the economic impact. So if you show these things and you're showing where it's coming from, you know what I mean? Then you just have to deal with the enormity that empirically it wasn't a small deal, right? And then it's like, okay, well, now that person has been, you know, has been faced with some information that they didn't know before. They likely are going to be less resistant, you know what I mean, to it. And then that helps to facilitate a more productive conversation. So I think it's getting from intention to productive conversation, which is a huge stumbling block. I think another challenge is that people think it noble that they rush into solutions without fully understanding the actual contours of the environment and the pathology. You know, it's amazing. And I get it. You know, I went to business school. I worked at these different fancy places. It's really important that people seem like they know what they're doing. So let's just charge the solution for something that's been happening for 400 years here and 576 years in total. It's absurd. You got to spend some time, really understand the problem, right? And then it puts you in a better position to come up with effective solutions that take into account what system dynamics are at play, right? So a huge part of it is just the first part, which is understanding it oneself, and then having an environment to facilitate a productive conversation so you can actually bring in the brilliance of other people to more effectively work on the solutions to get a multiplier effect. So those are different permutations of what people kind of see. I think what you're seeing now is a ton of reaction, right? Like people are, you know, they're looking for black banks, and you know, Google, where I've spoken to twice, is, you know, trying to make it more easily available for you to search for black business, and people are trying to show different things, right? The idea is, how do you help them organize it in ways that are compounding? And how do you help people understand that these actions and strategies and solutions are independent of these external stressors, right? Like the reason you do this is not because somebody was shot, right? You know what I mean? The reason you do this because it's necessary, because we're missing 6 million jobs, because it's impossible to have thriving communities on a gap of jobs, business, and capital. It does not exist anywhere, and it cannot exist anywhere. So independent of the optics, you always have to be driving towards the substance, and then helping people know that the pie is even bigger. For me, it's really important to talk with, I talk with everyone, constituents, right, from the layperson to the diplomat to the CXO, but it's also important to talk to decision makers, because they have an outside ability to affect environments and to facilitate change. You know what I mean? So those things are really important.
So to piggyback off of that reactionary aspect, how has the recent protests elevated this conversation? And do you think companies and people are serious about it for long term?
So I think the protests have been massive, right? A lot of this is reaction to George Floyd, compounded by COVID, right? It's compounded by the disproportionate effect clearly on Black people and the reporting on that. It's compounded by people have more time available to absorb media of all kinds and actually to be exposed to all this stuff. And I think it's set up a juxtaposition that's thrown them off, right? Like, people are not supposed to be murdered on camera in Black folks. I mean, in America, you know what I mean? Like, it's supposed to be equal opportunity. It's, you know, we're supposed to be post-racial. So it's created a disconnect. It's what I call like the piercing of the veil, right? And people are like, well, we got to do something about this. So they're trying to show how they can do something about it. The question is, what's that thing, right? Now, a lot of it has been symbolic. Again, if you don't have a framework, you'll kind of float everywhere and anywhere. You'll just be kind of random. My thing is, okay, to what extent is it manifesting PhD, creation of jobs, business, and capital? I remember I was talking at it with a very large firm, which you guys know, and they were in the process of, I think they had made Juneteenth like a holiday, right? Like, we're going to do, you know what I mean? We're going to do some service, we're going to do some other things, and, you know, it's a wonderfully symbolic thing. And I was just like, okay, so let's think about this from a PhD perspective. So if this is the only thing you're going to do, and I don't know what else you're going to do, but you haven't shared it yet, you're going to give a holiday to people who've never heard of this thing 3 weeks before, right? They don't even know what it is. And you're funding this holiday. So take your whole payroll globally and divide that by 365. And that's the economic cost that you're willing to pay this year and next year ad infinitum. How about you consider taking those resources and investing that, which is millions of dollars, by the way, and I'm being generous when I'm underestimating when I say that, and investing that in talent acquisition, in talent development, in talent retention, in talent promotion. How about you invest that in providing more onboarding for Black enterprise into your supply chain, because it's in the billions of dollars. How about you use that to provide more working capital for the Black enterprise, because your dream contract can bankrupt you, right? You have to spend much more than you're getting anytime soon. And as contract size grows over time, your access to capital has to complement it, right? So they give you the contract, you'll be unable to deliver. How about you use that for those kind of resources, things that are actually stimulative for solving the problem? You know what I mean? They hadn't thought about it that way. They were excited about the symbolism. You know what I mean? So these are, it's helping people understand, how do you get the 10x multiplier effect out about the good thing that you want to do? There's no question their intentions are good. The second thing is, you have to make sure that whatever you're doing is structural, because this is a moment in time, right? Like, I'm a student of US history. This is going to conclude, right, in a relatively short period of time. And then it's going to be followed by a pushback, because every movement that has associated with Black people in any way, shape, or form has followed that pattern, right, in the US. There's no indication that anything should be any different. So the impact should be structural. It should continue and resonate, over time. And then I think there's a lot of education that needs to go in place for folks, because a ton of the rank and file, they don't get it. They're like, I don't understand why Black people are upset. I mean, you were free, and then you got affirmative action, and you know what I mean? Like, you guys should be set, and all that kind of stuff. And unless you have the education, then you'll have your team, your rank and file, your employee base kind of pushing back on those programs. So that's my thought of that. A little too much symbolism, and people not really understanding that this is a moment in time, right? This isn't a new day on a go-forward basis.
All right, so for folks who are just learning this information, or even folks who've had this information previously, what's the best catalyst for people to educate others on this information?
I think there's a couple things. One is you get exposed to it yourself, right? Like, I put a lot of time, energy, and effort into distilling this into an extremely potent, short, easy to read kind of document, pulling it from hundreds of different sources, because to recreate this is quite a task, because people don't speak in terms of economics. They speak in terms of injustice, morality, civil, and all these qualitative issues, right? That folks don't really seem to care as much about as one would think. So to educate oneself on it, right? The second piece, and then there's references to everything, or where I draw everything from. The other thing is to just share it with your friends and family and all that, so people can don't be an island of knowledge and wisdom and understanding, right? Propagate that amongst your peer group and all those kinds of folks, so they can have access to it. Then I think from a structural perspective, there does need to be a massive realignment or augmentation of the curriculum in the K through 12. Right? We have millions of kids who are in school, and they're learning functional things and have no idea about the massive structural foundational aspect of the creation of the United States. And that has everything to do with Black people, right? And what was extracted and how that was utilized to build all these institutions and opportunities that people think are so awesome, and that are so awesome. This stuff is not, it's not qualitative. It's not an opinion piece. There are many things that are just factual, right? So augmenting the curriculum is critical, you know, whether it's in individual schools or across the district, stuff like that. So you have more empathy and understanding, and more people actually working on solving the problem or choosing to do business with Black enterprise and sharing with their political representatives that, hey, this is a really great thing to do, and it makes the pie bigger for everyone else, and kind of so on and so forth.
Right. How has your book and the data presented been related to the argument for reparations?
It provides the financial case for it. It's the reparations for what? It depends on who's talking about it, right? Generally, people are talking about, slavery and Jim Crow. The Black tax includes that, but it's more than just slavery and Jim Crow. That is the largest part of it by far, but it continues post-civil rights, right? So it's actually a bigger deal. And then it's like, well, what numbers are you talking about, and how do you justify it, and all that kind of stuff? Like all that's kind of laid out in the Black tax very clearly. And it's tough to refute. I mean, if you got a problem with it, you got to take it up with Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Duke, so on and so forth, and all those PhDs. And then if you've got a problem with that, there's 200 more sources I can give you. So it provides the underlying case to support that kind of that position without question.
Okay, I think this might be the last question just based on time here. But do you have any examples of companies or people that are actually doing a really good job on this and taking the lead, and what are they doing that stands out?
So it's always tough for me to answer questions like this, right? Because I need people to understand we're talking about multi-trillion-dollar differentials here. You know what I mean? So when you start talking about a really good job, what is the impact of that on a larger scale of things? So, but let me call out a few people that are doing things that are meaningful, right, and impactful. I think JP Morgan Chase is doing things that are meaningful and impactful in that they created a initiative called Advancing Black Pathways, right? It had started internally for advancing Black executives. They just saw a very low representation of Black executives within their firm. And it wasn't because of talent and skill and capability and all that kind of stuff. You had a lot of other things that were not surfacing their talent. People weren't getting put on the right assignments. They weren't getting the right level of exposure, mentorship, you know what I mean? So you need to know who the awesome folks are so you can be able to pick from it to make sure that's there. So they created something to do that, and then they expanded it beyond that, right? This whole initiative. Let me tell you what's most powerful about that. They were specific. It's advancing Black pathways. One of the Achilles heels for all these things, and why it's going to be extremely difficult, right, for you to see progress in a concentrated way because it's hyper diluted, is because people conflate Black and minority, diversity, and inclusion. That is not the same. Now let me give you some really concrete examples, right? Let's say you look at supply chain spend, large companies that have employees, right? The mega companies that are transformative. If you say, diversity, inclusion, and, equity, those are generally words for not white male, euphemisms, right? If you say who's that on planet Earth, it's 90% of people on planet Earth. It's a massively generalized group that you can put just about anybody into, right? So if you, for a specific problem, you have to have a tailored solution to it, not this hyper generalized solution. So if you said to yourself, we want to do more business with women-owned businesses, right? In our supply chain, I think that's fantastic. Double, triple, quadruple down on it. If you look at how much revenue is being driven from women-owned businesses that have employees, it's about 1.2 trillion. If you drill down and you say, of that 1.2 trillion, how much of that is coming from Black women-owned businesses that have employees? It's 2%. So it's not until the $99 that a sister will see any benefit from that kind of program that's targeted to women. It's going to be hyper diluted, right? For Black interests. If you say the same thing for our Latino brothers and sisters, right? Like we want to do more business with our Latino brothers and sisters. I think it's great. Double, triple, quadruple down, fantastic. For their businesses that have employees, how much revenue are they driving? About $380 billion. Wonderful. If you ask how much of that is coming from Black people, Black Latinos, it's 2%. Again, it's not until the $99 that a Black Latino is going to see any kind of economic benefit from that, because 98% of those folks are non-Black, right? So if So if you say to yourself, we want to do the same thing with our Asian brothers and sisters, which I think is great, double, triple, quadruple down on that, they're generating about $628 billion. But it's not Black by definition. If I add up the entire group of diverse ecosystem of businesses that have employees, right, from women and Latinos and Black folks and the others, only 4% of that is going to Black enterprise. 96% is going to kind of non-Black people. Unless you have a specific tailored solution, you're not going to have the desired income. What you're going to do is enrich other groups who are better capitalized, right? And that's what's been happening, right, for the last 60 years or so. You've got to have programs that are specific in their design, in their execution, in their funding, because when you have those things, you're going to see significant impact, right? And this stuff isn't zero sum. It's taught all over the place. It's a total abstraction. It's not true. It's not clear. You have to have specific solutions associated with folks. And the good thing is that it actually increases opportunities for everyone. But right now, what you're seeing is kind of the reverse, right? And it's very, very clear in the data. It's unfortunate, but it's demonstrable. And it's just, what it is. We have to be specific.
All right, fantastic discussion. I'm sure we could spend a lot more time on a lot of these topics, but in the interest of time, I'm going to send it over to Les for closing.
All right, so first of all, I want to thank Shawn for this information. This has been, again, like I said, it's always amazing to be able to sit down and listen to somebody that has put the work in with regard to this information and stuff that the general public just doesn't know. So Shawn, thank you for taking the time to kind of impart us on some of this knowledge and stuff that you spent years collecting and like you said, putting it in a format that really, really makes a lot of sense to, even the layman. You don't have to have a PhD to understand what the information you just gave us. So again, thank you for that. So for me, just listening to what Shawn was talking about, just try to kind of sum up in my thoughts and then kind of just give you some parting words. It's always difficult to come behind somebody like a Shawn that, like I say, just again puts that kind of that information out there in a way like he did. But I'll see if I can wrap it up. And Shawn, jump in if I say something that that you think I misinterpreted or not. But for me, just thinking about this whole scenario and everything and what Shawn was talking about, basically going back to slavery, this race that we call America, this race that we call the world, we weren't allowed to kind of start the race when the gun went off, so to speak. The race started and we were kind of held at the starting line for all of those years that Shawn kind of went through. Then at some point, and you can argue whether we actually started or whether we didn't, but I feel like at some point we were allowed to participate in the race. But at that point, if anybody has ever watched a track meet, again, if you're held for 5, 6 seconds, whatever amount of time, there's very little chance that you're going to win that race. And then in the midst of being allowed to start the race, we're constantly kind of dealing with obstacles that are kind of being placed in our way. That could be education, it could be justice, definitely money, like Shawn has talked about, healthcare. Again, all of those things that kind of go into people being able to come up and be successful. We're still not actually accessing. And Shawn, like I said, put it in very quantitative format. We're still not accessing those things to the degree that other groups are, which basically means, again, we started the race late and we're basically having to run the race a little slower because we're constantly having to deal with obstacles put in our way. So what can we do about it? As Shawn indicated, we need to, first of all, gather the knowledge to understand what we're in the midst of. And then there's going to be a need for this country to say, hey, we have to equalize some of these things. We have to equalize education. I forget the number, Shawn, but there was some number of, amount of money that's put into Black communities versus white communities. That has to be equalized. Businesses, there's a lot of conversation about the fact that when you go to, a venture capitalist or a bank, that they're loaning money or giving money to Blacks. They are, but as Shawn indicated, the issue is if you're a venture capital firm, let's say for example, and somebody comes in and say, well, how much money have you given to Blacks, or how much money have you given to minorities? And you say, let me tell you, let me sit you down. We've given $50 million to, small Black businesses, so on and so forth. And they're excited about it, and that's great. But then you ask the question, well, how much money have you given to other groups? And that number's 500 million. It kind of makes that 50 million not seem such a great accomplishment anymore. So again, those are the things that we need to be looking at. How do we make an adjustment in the way we're thinking and the way that we're doing? And if we do that, then like you say, we can kind of try to even out this thing. As far as the people on the call, what you've done is you basically said that you want to know more so you can do better. And not to turn this into a religious thing, but there is a passage in the Bible that says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And that's basically what people like Shawn are trying to help us with. And that's to basically give us the knowledge to make better decisions. And then he made a point, don't be an island of knowledge. So when you develop this knowledge and you're basically showing that you can do better for yourself and you can do better for your family, take that knowledge and hand it to somebody else so they can do the same thing. And that is how that's how we change this thing and turn it around and get it to a point where not just individuals, because Shawn, you made this point that there's a lot of conversation about how Blacks have the ability to do the same thing as everybody else. And again, in America, yes, there is an innate ability to be successful. And we have lots of examples of Blacks being successful. We have Black billionaires, we have Black millionaires. But as a whole, do we have the same economic access, the same educational access, where lots more of those people can have those same type of opportunities? That's the issue that we have. So yes, we've had a Black president, but do we still have issues after that? Yes, we do. So again, take those things that you learn and basically give them to that next person downwind, the same way we would with our children. We all, if anybody with children, your big thing is having your children be better than you were, to be in a better position than you were. And you do that by basically educating your children. Don't allow them to go through make the same mistakes and go through the same challenges that you went through if you can help it. We need to operate that way as a community. And if we do that, then like I said, we can kind of make some adjustments to the way this thing is going down. So I hope everybody enjoyed this session. PAI attempts to do these things on a regular basis. I will say that, Shawn can appreciate this, economics drives things. So again, for us to be able to keep doing the conferences that people have participated in, PAI is actually a full 501c3. And again, if you feel so moved, there is an opportunity for you to donate. And then that way we can continue to bring these special people like Shawn on to kind of, like I say, kind of help us move the needle in the direction that we need to have it move. So I think that's probably all I got to say. I'll pass it back over to Andre Thornton and close us up.
Yes, thanks. That's it. Thank you, everyone. What a Saturday afternoon. Hopefully you took something away from this. Shawn, we want to thank you again so much for sharing this information. We know, just based on looking at your record, that you have been doing this for a while and you will continue to share this message. Please let us know if there's anything that we can do to support you getting this word out. And I know many of us that have heard this will be thinking about things a little bit differently going forward. So we'll be back in touch with you, Shawn. Everyone that's participated, thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday. And PAI will be in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Please.
A couple things. We, I always, my thing is economics is the foundation upon which all else is built, right? You gotta invest in the future that you want, right? So you gotta invest in organizations that care about you and that are working for you, whether you're doing business with them or whether you're making donations to them. You know what I mean? You can only get done as much as the resources that you have. So make the investment in the group, and then make the investment in yourselves across your group. You probably have entrepreneurs and service providers, or you work for companies. I mean, you can have influence, right? Make sure you're doing like a great job. Like these principles that I talk about, we live it as a family, and then we also live it in terms of our business. I've been offered book deals. I turned those things down, right? Because I don't have say in how things would go. I don't have say if I do that. And actually practicing PhD. I have a big ecosystem of entrepreneurs that I work with, and they practice PhD. In terms of how they raise capital, whenever possible, wherever possible, they're utilizing. They're starting with that as a mindset, right? Whether it's the attorneys, whether it's accounting, whether it's audit, whether it's whoever, if they're saying if there's some Black talent out there, that's terrific. How do we utilize it? Like you got to do that. We got to do more than just kind of talk and learn and think things are really interesting. You got to do business and commerce with each other, and that's a reinforcing, compounding thing, over time. So invest, in this, organization. Buy the book, share the book. Andre, you reached out to me, and I had this wonderful opportunity to talk to scores of people who have all these secondary, tertiary networks that can reach out, that can have tremendous effect, right? Like that's what's happened. I spoke at the UN because an ambassador thought it was important. I spoke at Google because someone there thought it was important. I spoke at the ELC, which is the foremost organization for kind of Black leaders. I keynoted there because someone super senior thought it was important. That's kind of how it happens. We can help accelerate that process by kind of sharing out. The other thing I would say is we got to remember that this is one conversation and what should be a series of conversations. I've only touched on a portion of this. This is not like the definitive piece. There's far more to discuss, amongst yourselves and amongst other people. I'm just laying out the framework so that people can enter the discussion with the same series of facts and not just passion and about their positions, so we can actually be productive. And so other people who are not Black can also understand why this is so important, and they cannot feel excluded or upset when people speak specifically about Black issues, which is a problem. People take offense to it. It's hard to have a conversation. People start off being offended, right? That you're speaking Black in particular. So donate to the group. Do business amongst each other and everyone recommend great Black businesses and service providers, wonderful experiences that you've had to each other. You know what I'm saying? Buy the book, share the book, you know what I mean? So on and so forth.